Okay, so now we're going to talk about how we're going to set up our still life. Now, as always, when you're working at home, I do need you to tape all 4 edges of your paper. You have to, again, do as I say, not as I do scenario, which is what it is. You're going to want to make sure that you have your kneaded eraser, your hard eraser. You're going to want to have some vine and compressed charcoal out. Now, the first day that you are working, you don't need to use your compressed charcoal, okay? You can just entirely rely on your vine. That is the perk about working on things in 2 days as opposed to 2 hours, is that you do have double the amount of time to work. So you're able to kind of go at a little bit different of a pace than normal. You can spend more time on your mapping, which realistically speaking, I do think a lot of us need to be doing. So I'm gonna start by lightly toning my paper because I like working additively and reductively, and you need to work from toned paper to do that. Now I'm not gonna tone it as dark as we did with our fabric piece, where we worked entirely reductively, but I am gonna get a good amount of charcoal on the page. When I get to that last bit of charcoal, honestly, just grabbing it with my chamois, and I'm going to push it around the surface. Okay, I just want to get my page to a good middle gray value. You can see that some areas are darker or lighter than others. When you do this again, sometimes it takes more than 1 layer. Having tape on your sides gives you that good clean edge. And again, now you can see that piece of charcoal that I was carrying is gone. It was just a way of kind of using even the smallest parts, blending out. When I work from a reductive surface, I do think that it is important to erase my rule of 3 grid. Okay, but if you've watched our first video, or the first part of the video on how we set up our station, then you'll know that I'm already thinking about composition. I've already highlighted that I want my image to kind of have a composition that makes us look that way, okay? It's gonna swoop down into the scene. So I've laid out my objects accordingly. Now, when I start this, I really want you to take the time to focus on those basic shapes, okay? I'm going to start by just kind of very lightly sketching in as if it were my paper, or, well, as if it is my paper. Very lightly putting in where my fabric is. Now I know my fabric is on top of a rectangular surface. I'm not quite sure how it sits on there. I think that the front is here and it actually goes back in space, but I don't want to have some open lid syndrome. Got my boxes, which are here. It's my rectangular shape for my cards. There is my snail shape, and then there's my jar shape. Now, one thing that I'm noticing already is that I'm kind of setting myself up for a little bit of failure here, because right now my objects take up this top quadrant and I'm leaving all of this space open. And this is why that mapping phase is so important, because we don't want to like leave so much negative space. We keep having these objects that are just floating in the background. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change up my approach here. I'm going to erase that, and I'm going to start by trying to draw the rectangular cards at the bottom, and I'm going to measure carefully to get their angle right. I'm going to draw through my objects. I'm using a lot of line right now, which is very different from what we did with the fabric. But I'm doing it so that I can draw through and just kind of get my mapping appropriate. Now I know that my fabric comes down here. and that got my studio assistant Arthur trying to give me some assistance, which is very unnecessary. Unnecessary studio assistant cat. Yep. Down we go. Thank you. I'm just gonna make a guest appearance right across the board. So I'm gonna hint at where my fabric is down here. See that there's some other folds. I know that the box comes up against one of the cards. And then that's where this is, my actual card shape. Now I'm gonna start using the sides of my tools, right? You can see that I'm sort of trying to use that to show kind of depth and show that there's one face and two face of this box. It's gonna be a lot like finding our complex still life where we just focused on one object, but the really difficult thing is now you're focusing on 3 objects. Now you're focusing on creating a whole scene, okay? And I know that that can be adding a lot. I've got my weird snail creature, right? But again, break that down to a circle and a triangle, which makes it look like a very, very sad ice cream cone, okay? My cards are still staying rectangles. My fabric, I'm just kind of loosely scribbling in. And then I can do some comparative measuring to make sure that I'm getting my heights right. But the jar, see, so my snail is a little bit off center. He's over here. That's where my snail actually is. I'm moving things a lot while I'm working, right? There's too much times where when we're mapping and we're not actually making adjustments. We're just sticking with things where we think they went the first time. And if we did that, I'd have a finished drawing in my top right corner and I would have nothing down here. And right, so completely changing up my actual composition has made a huge difference in my drawing. Just doing a little bit of a teaching demo.
Yeah.
Got my roommate just came home. So now I'm gonna draw in the rectangular shape for this shark jar. You know that the antennas go up a little bit. When we've drawn stars and ellipses in the past, right? We know that we focus on it starting as a rectangle. It's really important to me to measure this negative space, okay? Because that's how I know where these objects are in relationship to each other. And that's part of my comparative measuring and helping me to get this shape accurate. So now I'm gonna start including my ellipses so that I can kind of get the curve jar shape accurate. And now the important thing is that you've got to draw everything you see, okay? So I'm gonna start mapping in some of the small details now that I know that my objects are where they're supposed to be, okay? I'm gonna start by doing a little bit more with the snail whose shell kind of comes out in space, right? See how it's gone from a circle to like a snail shell? And get its little snail face. And then we're gonna not worry super much about its face just yet. When I'm working on these cards, you know, I'm looking at the fact that their corners are kind of rounded, that they're creating a little bit of a shadow here. There is a sort of hand shape on it. Now this is all gonna get kind of erased out. Like this is kind of frosting details, so I don't need to super focus on what's on each card. But I do plan on drawing what's on each card. Like if you've got labels on something, you're gonna need to work on, oh, I'm gonna have to draw that label. So, you know, maybe if you don't wanna do lettering, don't pick lettering because I've got lettering at the base of my card and I'm gonna probably have to flip it upside down to do that. But really what I wanna make sure is that I'm just hinting at where things are gonna be, so that I know later on kind of where everything is. So everything's just kind of moving. I'm going to start laying in where my folds are, okay? So we can see that. Using my fabric where I'm going to turn my charcoal on its side to kind of get that shape going. I'm going to focus on maybe doing some of the circles in it, right? So I can kind of get some of my pattern where it's supposed to be. Okay. Now again, if you don't have pattern fabric, that's okay, but you do want to start establishing kind of where your value is and where tones are going to be. Well, the good thing about having pattern on fabric is that I'm no longer worried about drawing circles, but with like kind of shapes instead. I'm going to quickly lay in a little bit of value here. Now when I'm doing this, instead of outlining, I'm reinforcing these edges because we've got some scenarios where we get some really fuzzy edges happening, okay? I don't want this card to lose its proportions. I don't want this card to lose its proportions, okay? I'm gonna start shading that in. I'm gonna find my little shark shape, which now I've got baby shark very much stuck in my head, which is always kind of weird, but what are you gonna do? So I'm gonna put him in my jar. Because he's in a jar, things are kind of squished and really weird. Pretty gross, but also pretty delightful. And for me, that's kind of the point of this still life. As a self-portrait, it's a little gross and a little delightful. Polka dot fabric, tarot cards, snail, baby shark, sure, right? So I'm just gonna keep mapping in my basic shapes and my fabric. The good thing is that when you do have pattern fabric, sometimes you can show where an edge is underneath by showing what happens to the fabric as it moves with this kind of surface, because the pattern's gonna move and it's gonna flatten out. It's also a little bit more challenging. I'm gonna go ahead and kind of fudge it, because what happens is that my drawing actually kind of stops here, and I don't really want my still life to stop there. I want it to go off the side of my page. I think that that will be a more dynamic composition, personally. And you're allowed to make that decision. So far, we've only had 1 or 2 people take the time to just let their drawing go right off the edge of the paper, and it's allowed, okay? Like, don't be afraid to kind of make that change. So again, I'm gonna be worried about kind of drawing where my fabric is folding. I'm using the polka dots to kind of show where folds are happening. And I'm just gonna focus on mapping my drawing as much as I can, and that includes starting to lay in value. I'm gonna make decisions of areas that are gonna be very dark, coming up to something lighter. So I'm gonna make the decision that my background is gonna be dark. You can see that I'm establishing a horizon line. When I'm doing that, my horizon line is right here behind my objects. And I'll let it get lighter in space. I'm gonna let my foreground kind of come off the edge of the page. And that's what you're gonna do. Your entire first class, you're gonna focus on finding the basic shapes of your complex objects. Let me scratch that and switch that order. You're gonna focus on setting up a still life. Then you are going to probably take about 10 to 15 minutes to do that, honestly. It takes a lot longer than you think, and you really want to pick your objects with care and set a stage for them. Then you are going to begin your drawing, and you're going to start by finding your basic shapes, which are rectangles, ellipses, right? The ellipses at the top and bottom of the jar, the ellipses in the snail. You're going to find the folds in your fabric, and you're going to start establishing light. You're going to start looking at what makes those objects a little bit more complex, i.e. the circle that the snail started as versus now being a more complex shell that's kind of moving in space and popping out. This box versus, you know, being an initial rectangle versus an actual box that's moving back in space, the cards that are falling on top of one another, the drapery and the shadows in my fabric. That's your goal for day 1, because day 2 is when you're going to really start thinking of it in terms of like, this is you baking a cake, and day 2 is you frosting the cake. Really take our time to map, okay? That's been our struggle so far this semester, okay? Thank you.